And this panel is entitled Police Violence and the Fourth Amendment. And we have an all-star cast of panelists to be here with us this morning. And I will introduce each of them briefly, but I encourage you to look in your programs for a more full biography. To my immediate right is Professor Devon Carbado. And Professor Devon Carbado is the Associate Vice Chancellor of Bruin X for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Honorable Harry Pregerson Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law. He teaches constitutional criminal procedure, constitutional law, critical race theory, and criminal adjudication, and writes in the areas of employment discrimination, criminal procedure, constitutional law, and the intersection of race, law, and police violence. He's won numerous teaching awards, including the Law School's Rudder Award for Excellence in Teaching and the university's Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2005, he was named an inaugural recipient of the Fletcher Foundation Fellowship, modeled on the Guggenheim Fellowships, and it's awarded to scholars whose work furthers the goals of Brown versus Board of Education. He attended Harvard Law School, and I can't begin to articulate the influence that Professor Carbado has had not only in his field, but on the academy in so many ways. And he's been a great mentor to so many of us in the field, and I was honored to be present at the AALS, the Association of American Law Schools annual meeting in San Francisco in January of this year, where Professor Carbado received the prestigious Clyde Ferguson Award. To his immediate right is Professor Nancy Leong, and she's a professor of law at the University of Denver Stern College of Law. Professor Leong clerked for Judge Kermit Lopez of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and she's practiced First Amendment law with Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and has taught at the William & Mary School of Law, the American University Washington College of Law, and the Georgetown University Law Center. She's the author of over 30 law review articles on topics relating to constitutional rights and remedies, criminal procedure, anti-discrimination, law and culture, and judicial decision-making. Professor Leong is also the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Distinguished Scholar Award at the University of Denver for this academic year. Her research was also selected for presentation at the prestigious Yale/Stanford/Harvard Junior Faculty Forum held at Yale Law School. She attended Stanford Law School, and you should read all of her wonderful articles, but you should also follow her on Twitter. And Professor Leong noted in a recent Twitter post that this here, the piece she's writing for this symposium in the GW Law Review, will be the first time out of all those 30-plus articles that she's ever repeated publication with the same journal. So we're honored that you're going to be publishing with us twice. And again, I recommend her Twitter feed. To her right is Dean Song Richardson. And Dean Richardson is the interim dean and professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, with a joint appointment in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society. She's a leading expert on implicit racial and gender bias, and her interdisciplinary research uses lessons from cognitive and social psychology to decision-making and judgment. Professor Richardson is currently working on a book that examines the legal and moral implications of mind sciences research on policing and criminal procedure. Her legal career has included partnership at a boutique criminal law firm and work as a state and federal public defender in Seattle, Washington. She was also an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and immediately upon graduation from law school, Dean Richardson was a Skadden Arps Public Interest Fellow with the National Immigration Law Center in Los Angeles and the Legal Aid Society's Immigration Unit in Brooklyn. She attended Yale Law School, and she's a giant in her field, and everything she writes seemingly breaks new ground. And I particularly appreciate that she is the dean of UC Irvine Law School, and she, like her two co-panelists, traveled from the West to be here with us this morning. And I greatly appreciate all three of you being here, and I ask you to join me in a round of applause for our panelists. So I believe we're going to begin with Professor Carbado.
So thank you very much for that generous introduction. It really is my pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the lot of you for conceiving of this event and for inviting my participation. And I'm particularly thrilled to be on a panel with Song Richardson and Nancy Leong, both of whose work has certainly shaped my own thinking about race, policing, and the Fourth Amendment. So what I thought I might do in the limited time that I have is offer a framework that I hope provides at least a partial explanation for police violence against African Americans, and in that context, reveal the ways in which Fourth Amendment law is doing work. I want to advance three broad claims. One is that police violence against African Americans transcends the conduct of particular officers engaging in particular acts of violence against particular individuals, which is to say, police violence is a structural problem. The second point is that police contact plays an important role in the police violence problem, by which I mean police contact creates a condition of possibility for police violence. And finally, that Fourth Amendment law plays an enormously important role facilitating contact between the police and African Americans. So let's start at the very beginning, because it's a very good place to start, with what I might mean by police violence as a structural phenomenon. So I'm a board member of the African American Policy Forum, which is a think tank that Kimberly Crenshaw and Luke Harris started about 20 years ago. And in that context, part of our effort is to explain racism as a structural phenomenon. And one of the ways in which we do that is not by talking about people, but by talking about cows. So you see that particular image. And we show this image and we stipulate that the cows are sick, and then we ask something like the following questions. Why are the cows sick? And if we engage in a conversation, we tend to get two kinds of responses. One set of responses focus on the cows themselves. So the notion might be that the cows are not grazing properly, the cows are not drinking properly, the cows are not pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, let's say. So it's something about the cows and what they're not doing for themselves, or perhaps what they're doing to themselves. Another set of responses focuses on the farmer. It turns out that the farmer loves his dog, but the cows not so much. The farmer prefers the other animals to the cows. The farmer might be a cowcist, analogous to a racist. You get the idea. So the point is that the answers tend to focus on the cows or on the farmer, but when you pull back the frame, you begin to see that quite apart from what the farmer might be doing to the cows, quite apart from what the cows might be doing to themselves, they're going to be sick. And they're going to be sick because they live in a toxic environment. So if we want to think critically about the cow's sickness, we have to take into account these environmental conditions. In other words, we need to think structurally. This obviously does not mean that what the farmer does is irrelevant. It clearly does not mean that what the cow does is irrelevant. It simply means that we need to broaden the frame and think more structurally about the problem. The question is whether or not we might think about police violence in the same way. That is to say, move beyond a conversation about individual officers and think more structurally. And my answer to that question is yes, there is a way for us to do that. So let me start by giving you a window on what I might mean. So this is the schematic that I have in mind, the framework that I have in mind. And the first 2 points on the framework I think are rather intuitive, which is to say that repeated police interactions expose African Americans to the possibility of violence. Think about the matter this way. If you're outside of the zone of police contact, you're outside of the zone of police violence. If you're constantly in that space, it ratchets up the likelihood that you will experience violence. Now, we could tell, of course, a very thick story about the space between police contact and police violence. I don't have time to get into that here. I'm sure Song Richardson's presentation in particular might riff on some of what's going on in that space that makes African Americans particularly vulnerable to police violence. The third dimension of the schematic, again, is one that I don't think is particularly controversial. To the extent that police culture encourages violence, at least implicitly, that's what you get. If police trainings do not deal with violence, that's what you get. If police unions are bent on simply protecting police officers and not engaging the question of violence robustly, that is what you will get. Now, the next stage of the analysis asks something like the following question. So what happens when violence interacts with the legal system? So we're stipulating that there's been a moment of violence, and now we're asking, how does that violence interact with the legal system? And there are a number of dynamics that I think we have to take quite seriously. So dynamic 4 is the justifiable force problem, by which I mean police violence plus the legal system oftentimes equals justifiable force. And there are a number of ways in which that can occur. A prosecutor might decide not to bring charges. That's a moment in which the violence becomes justifiable force. Or the prosecutor brings charges, but a grand jury refuses to issue an indictment. That's another moment in which police violence becomes justifiable force. Or the prosecutor brings charges, the grand jury indicts, and a trier fact concludes that it's reasonable. Each of these are instances in which you have police violence, you have an interaction with the legal system, and the output is reasonable force. Another set of dynamics involve qualified immunity and indemnification. Now, I can't get deep into the qualified immunity doctrine, because if I go there, you'll have to say, come back, come back. I mean, it's just really fraught doctrinal mess, is the short of it. But I think it's fair to say that the qualified immunity doctrine creates barriers to holding police officers civilly liable. That's not, I don't think, a particularly controversial claim to assert. The other dimension to this problem is assuming that you win your civil suit against a police officer. It turns out that the officer likely will pay nothing because city governments indemnify. So my colleague Joanna Schwartz has conducted a study that looks systematically at this particular question, and there's a yawning gap between what individual officers pay on the one hand and what cities and municipalities pay on the other. The final dimension of this cluster of problems is police department liability. That is to say, the difficulty of holding police departments liable for the acts of their individual officers. Why do we care about dynamics 4, 5, and 6? Because they create a disincentive for police officers to exercise care. If an officer knows at the front end that my act of violence is going to be translated into justifiable force, or that I'll be qualified immune, or that I won't have to pay anything, or that the department won't be held accountable, that diminishes the incentive for that officer to exercise care. It's a standard incentive story, which takes us right back to the police violence problem. So this, I want to suggest then, is just a broad way of thinking about some of the dynamics that are at play. Significantly, each of these dynamics are themselves structures that I could spend an awful lot of time going into, but I won't because I don't have an awful lot of time. What I want to do instead now is focus just a little bit more attention on the factors that cause African Americans to be vulnerable to repeated police interactions. And I'll talk about mass criminalization, the Fourth Amendment, and then I will shut up. So with respect to mass criminalization, I mean here the criminalization of relatively non-serious activities. One can also think about mass criminalization as the diffusion of criminal justice actors, practices, and norms into other dimensions of the welfare state. So think about, for example, police officers in school. I'm not going to be talking about the diffusion problem. I'm going to be talking about the criminalization of relatively non-serious activities. This is the list. I'm not going to read it off. You can look as I speak. The basic point is to note the extent to which relatively non-serious activities become criminalized. The other thing is to pause and reflect on is whether this reflects to some extent the criminalization of poverty, the extent to which being poor itself can render you vulnerable to certain kinds of quote-unquote crimes. The final thing I want to say about mass criminalization is that it's important for us to pay attention to it because it's a source of police empowerment in the following sense. If these are the predicate crimes that are at play across jurisdictions in the United States, it means that when police officers leave the station, they already have probable cause. It's pretty easy to have probable cause against a backdrop of activities that are criminalized along the following sense. So let's switch gears. These are just some examples of how mass criminalization play themselves out in the context of Ferguson. I won't say more about that. And think specifically about the Fourth Amendment. So this is the text of the Fourth Amendment. I'll get to it if I can. All right, here we go. The text of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, as you know, protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. And what that means concretely is that governmental conduct that is not a search and seizure is governmental conduct that falls outside of the regulatory reach of the Fourth Amendment. So if it's not a search or seizure, the Fourth Amendment has nothing to say about it. If it is a search or seizure, that doesn't mean that the conduct is unconstitutional. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, not searches and seizures per se. What I want to do now is just point you to a list of activities that the Supreme Court has said are not seizures or searches. Why is that important? It's important because to the extent that it's not a search or a seizure, it means that the government doesn't have to justify it. So if Tanya's standing on the street corner on a given afternoon and the cops have no reason to think that she's done anything wrong, the officers can follow her, can question her, where are you going, what are you doing, where have you been, can ask her for permission to search her bag. All of the activities that I've listed on this slide are ones in which the officers can engage without any justification at all. We're stipulating that Tanya's done anything wrong because they're not searches and seizures. So that's the first move. And if it's the case that the officer doesn't need any justification to engage in those forms of interactions, it increases the likelihood of police contact. If you don't need any justification, it means that you can engage in that conduct and likely will. The other thing to note here is that if the conduct listed on this slide are racially motivated, that too is not a problem for Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment law is unconcerned with racially motivated conduct that does not rise to the level of a search or seizure. Now, you might see there's some other constitutional provision that's ready and waiting to deal with you. I would say theoretically that's true, but we could talk about why that in practice doesn't provide much protection at all. So let's move from the question of whether the Fourth Amendment is triggered to a moment in which it is. I want to focus a little bit on traffic stops and then I'll stop. So the easiest way for me to present the traffic stop problem and why it creates police contact between African Americans is to invite the following scenario. So imagine that I'm driving home from work one day. My colleague is doing the same thing. One of us is black and the other one is white. Stipulate that I'm the black guy. So we're both driving home from work. The cops see both of us commit a traffic infraction and say, we're going to stop the black guy. Again, that's me. The cop stops me. I say that's a problem. You're stopping me because I'm black. That is not a problem under Fourth Amendment law. The fact that the officer has probable cause to stop me for a traffic infraction gives the officer authority to stop me for that traffic infraction. The fact that it might be racially motivated is irrelevant. 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 You don't look shocked. Is irrelevant for purposes of Fourth Amendment law, which is to say you can have racial motivation, express racial motivation, to engage in traffic stops so long as you also have probable cause. Now, I will skip that and simply show you the kind of conduct that rise to the level of traffic infractions. If you drive people, you're committing a traffic infraction. If you didn't know that, you know that now. This is significant because it means, again, that traffic infractions can be used as a pretext for police officers to engage in racial profiling. The broader point I'm trying to make, and here is where I will stop, is that there are lots of ways in which Fourth Amendment law facilitates contact between African Americans and the police. It does so by deciding that certain kinds of conduct reside outside of the realm of Fourth Amendment law, and it does so by rendering certain kinds of conduct reasonable. I could talk about the stop and frisk practices as well, which are supported by a low level of evidentiary showing, meaning reasonable suspicion, but I won't do that. I'll simply end by focusing again our attention on the work that police conduct does initially in creating a condition of possibility for police violence. It seems to me in all the conversations that we've been having about police violence, we're focused on the after the fact phenomenon and not paid enough attention to the conditions of possibility that's created by police contact to begin with. Fourth Amendment law is an important part of the story. It's not the only part of the story, but it's critical that we begin to think harder and more carefully about the role Fourth Amendment law creates, creating pathways to police violence. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, thank you very much for having me here at the symposium. Thanks to all of the law review members for just a really exceptionally well-run event, and especially Jill Greenfield for, I want to give a special shout out just for organizing everything so wonderfully, and thank you to Roger for inviting me and for that wonderful introduction. And I have to say, I agree. I think everybody should follow me on Twitter, and my handle is at Nancy Leong. So I am going to talk a little bit about and I think this picks up nicely on some of the things that Devon discussed in his talk about how police departments are attempting to address issues of excessive force within their departments. And in many departments, this is happening through efforts to diversify. Typically, this takes place along lines of race, or at least that's where the focus has been. I'd like to talk about another potential source of diversity, and that is hiring more women. And so what I'd like to ask all of you to do is to engage in a thought experiment with me. What would policing look like if half of all police officers were women? How would this change the culture of law enforcement entities? And how would it change the way that law enforcement officers interact with the communities that they serve? Now, as we think about this question, I want to just start by sharing some statistics, and I will certainly stipulate at the outset that there is not as much information out there as one might like there to be. So I think one thing certainly to come out of my talk is that I wish there was more empirical information. Somebody, probably not me, I would like to see somebody gather it. But so everything that I'm going to share is either from a Pew Research poll, the FBI, or a pair of studies that were commissioned by the National Center for Women and Policing. So right now, police departments are about 13% women, with most women serving in departments in big cities. That's from the most recent data available, which is from 2013. But women, they're 13% overall. Only about 10% of supervisors and 3% of department chiefs are women. So basically, police departments are like all other organizations, right? Like there's attrition towards the top. In terms of specifically the use of force and the use of force that is allegedly or deemed excessive, in a study of 7 large police departments, women police officers were 12.7%, so about the national average. Women police officers were about 12.7% of officers, but accounted for only 5% of citizen complaints of excessive force. Women were only 2% of sustained allegations of excessive force. And in terms of judgments and settlements paid out by cities for claims of excessive force, women only accounted for 6% of those claims. And I want to be clear that all of these numbers refer to men and women who had field assignments. In other words, assignments where they're interacting with the public. So the difference is not explainable by the fact that women had desk jobs and men were out in the field, right? Like it's more complicated than that. And this is consistent with other research about the way that men and women officers behave. So, for example, a statistic that many people may not know is that 72% of officers have never discharged their duty weapon while they were actually on duty outside of required training or at a firing range. So most cops have never fired their gun while they were on duty. Among those that have, or I should say, of police officers overall, 30% of men report that they have fired their service weapon while on duty. That's in comparison to 11% of women. And I want to note, again, that these are people with similar assignments. These are people who are in the field. These are not people with desk jobs. There's also research that indicates that in the aggregate, men and women have different attitudes towards policing. So, for example, when presented with the statement that, quote, some people can only be brought to reason the hard physical way, unquote, 46% of men, but only 33% of women expressed agreement with that. In other words, women expressed more of a view that people could be brought to reason through other methods, like communication or de-escalation. Likewise, with the statement, quote, it is more useful to be aggressive than courteous in some parts of the city, 58% of men, but only 48% of women agreed with that. So one takeaway, of course, and I think this goes to Devon's point that many of these issues really are structural and institutional. One takeaway is that institutional culture is strong. So women's views, in many cases, trend in the same direction as their male counterparts. But there are a number of statistically significant differences. I've given you a few of them. In terms of what men and women believe and how they behave, and I think it's worth looking at that. And then all of this, of course, is complemented by a whole lot of qualitative research, interviews with women police officers, and anecdotes. Women report using communication to manage situations with suspects who are physically larger than they are, that kind of thing. Now, of course, that's hard to measure empirically, but I think it's worth, taking account of that as well. A brief digression. Whenever I talk about this topic, someone wants to stop me right here and say, well, but isn't it the case that most women aren't physically capable of being police officers? And so this is where a different strand of my research actually becomes very useful. So for the past 2 years or so, I have been studying sex segregation in sports, which is actually the default for most sports, and this question of men's and women's relative athletic abilities. And what I found is that the issue is actually pretty nuanced. So to generalize a bit, what the research does actually show is that, on average, men are better than women at athletic pursuits for which testosterone provides an advantage. No surprise there, right? So in other words, pursuits that prioritize speed and strength, things like running and weightlifting. So on average, men are faster and stronger. When we turn to athletic pursuits that prioritize other abilities like agility, coordination, accuracy, and strategy, the male advantage reduces or disappears altogether. And 3 examples of athletic pursuits where women, in fact, compete very successfully with men are fencing, wrestling, and shooting. In wrestling, I'll offer an additional caveat, which is that women compete successfully against men within their weight class. But my point here is really just that if we don't think that being of a relatively slight build is disqualifying for a male wannabe police officer, then I'm not sure why we would for a woman with a similar build. So to bring this back to policing, a couple of points. I want to point out that the sports that I've mentioned, fencing, wrestling, shooting, these are combat-relevant activities. They're activities that we might think are relevant to the job of police officers, maybe with an asterisk next to the shooting one, which I'll come back to later. Second, when we talk about police officers, we're not talking about average men and women in terms of fitness. We're talking about people who hopefully are at least somewhat above the average in terms of fitness. And so the question is not really who is, stronger or more athletic. It's whether members of either sex are above, some appropriate threshold that is necessary to allow them to police ordinary members of the public effectively. Related to this point about athleticism, sometimes people also bring up the question of whether women police officers will be more likely to shoot because they're afraid of being physically overpowered. A couple of responses to that. As I've already mentioned, first of all, the existing data don't support that. I just mentioned that women are much less likely to have fired their weapon while on duty than are men. But also, male cops frequently say that they had to shoot somebody. They just had to shoot somebody because they were scared. Some of you may be familiar with this quote from Darren Wilson, who's the police officer who shot Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014. So these are Darren Wilson's words, quote, "When I grabbed him," meaning Michael Brown, "the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan." Wilson also described Mike Brown as a demon. Wilson was 6'4" and 210 pounds at the time of the shooting. So it doesn't appear that men, even very large men, are immune from shooting because they got scared. And so if that's the case, it's not clear to me why we would use that assumption to disqualify women. So to bring that around to the thought experiment that I began with, I think that it is worth thinking through what might happen or what we might predict would happen if police departments were to hire more women. And I want to get one sort of potential objection out of the way. I want to emphasize that this doesn't rely on essentializing stereotypes about how women are more gentle or more civilized or better communicators or anything like that. What I'm getting at instead is just that we live in a society where people are socialized differently depending on a whole host of demographic factors. Like depending on your race or your gender, people react to you differently. And it's like everything else, right? Like different life experiences make you a different person with different characteristics. And so it makes sense that in the aggregate, hiring more women would mean hiring more people with a somewhat different set of skills and strengths, a different approach to policing. And so with that said, I see a number of potential advantages to hiring more women, specifically with respect to the issue of police violence. And I'm going to name 5. The first is that the statistics I have mentioned suggest that hiring more women may reduce instances of excessive force overall, right? And that's what the research that is out there shows. Like women are less likely to have allegations of excessive force made against them in the first place. They're less likely to have those allegations sustained against them. Relatedly, a second reason that it may potentially be a benefit to hire more women as police officers is that it'll be less expensive. Now, the reason not to use excessive force on someone is not that, I mean, I would say that the best reason, the best argument against excessive force is not that it's expensive to beat people up, but certainly, you know, I mean, if women are less likely to commit excessive force, well, that's going to be less money paid out by police departments and ultimately taxpayers in settlements and judgments. A third reason is simply that, half the people in the world are women, and it may well be that some members of the public, some suspects may relate better to women than to men police officers. I mean, there are approximately, 1 million studies out there by social psychologists that suggest that people relate better to other people who they have something in common with. And so I think that having more women on the streets could potentially provide an opportunity for better relations with the public as a whole. A fourth potential advantage with hiring more women, fewer problems with sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And there are many reports, and I can go into this in more detail in Q&A if people are interested, of male cops engaging in sexual harassment or abuse of women suspects or just members of the public in general. There's that particularly horrific example of the police officer in Oklahoma. I think it was last year, and this was a cop who essentially raped several women. Now, I'm not saying that women don't sexually harass or sexually assault people. They do, but the incidence is much lower. I mean, I have scoured the internet and have literally been able to find one example of an allegation of sexual assault against a female police officer, whereas there are just, scores of allegations as well as convictions of sexual assault-related, crimes and other issues involving male cops. And then the fifth reason that it might be a good idea to hire more women police officers is to change the culture of police departments. And again, this harkens back to what Devon spoke about and the structural issues that are present in police departments and, frankly, in our jurisprudence as well. One thing that appears to heighten tensions between cops and communities is, for lack of a better word, kind of the macho culture that's present in a lot of departments, or at least divisions within departments. And I think less of that would probably improve relations between police officers and the communities that they police, and we might speculate would reduce the incidence of situations, of contacts that lead to some sort of violent encounter or to excessive force in the first place. Angela Harris actually wrote about this back in 2001 and talked about feminizing, that's her word, police training as a way of counteracting violence. Interestingly, she didn't talk specifically about actually increasing the number of women police officers. And then finally, all of this is consonant, is in harmony with this line of research that has emerged, suggesting that one problem with policing is just over-policing, like doing more than is actually necessary to serve the goals of, detecting crime and keeping the public safe. So maybe you could use X amount of force here without violating the Constitution, but is it actually necessary, or is there another way? Like, could you talk to the suspect, or could you use a less forceful technique that maybe takes longer but accomplishes the same objective? Or, maybe you could, compliant with the Constitution, chase down this drug suspect on a busy street with people everywhere and bring him into custody right now using force. But maybe there's another way. If a suspect isn't violent, I think there's a pretty decent argument that in many cases it might be better to let the suspect get away and try again under different circumstances. It might be safer for everybody involved. My sense is that there's a risk that police officers start to view the ceiling as the floor, and to say that, well, I can use this amount of force. The Constitution allows me to use this amount of force. Therefore, I should use this amount of force. And I think that thinking, that thinking is detachable from the broader goals of policing, and we should think about how to do that. And so just to conclude, I think that hiring more women police officers could have a positive effect on this over-policing problem as well, given that women are more likely to say that there are ways to deal with people other than force. And my time is up, so I will stop there and look forward to Q&A. Thank you.
Dean Richardson.
I don't know what it says about me that I would love to switch places with you and stand up
Absolutely.
instead of sit. So thank you. Before I begin, I just want to thank once again the Law Review and Dean Roger Fairfax for inviting me here to speak with all of you today. And like Devon, I want to also thank my co-panelists, Devon Carbado and Nancy Leong, whose scholarship has also influenced my own thinking. So in the brief time that I have with all of you today, I want to speak about what I think of as the epidemic of police racial violence taking place across the country. And often when we hear the media talk about this issue, the conversation seems to follow two familiar paths. So when we hear about police violence, and specifically police racial violence, on the one hand, we say that this occurs because police officers are racist. On the other hand, what we'll hear people say is the reason we have disparities in police uses of force are because Black individuals act differently. They are more dangerous, or police officers are more likely to view their actions reasonably as being more dangerous. And while some of these two different ways of speaking about racial violence may be true some of the time, what I want to suggest is even if every single officer were as egalitarian as we would want them to be, and even if every individual of every gender and every race was acting in identical ways, we should still expect, and in fact, we should predict that there would be racialized police violence, racial disparities in the way that police exercise their uses of force. And the reason for that, there are multiple reasons for that, including some of which we've heard today. They're institutional, they are systemic, and they are individual. I want to focus most on the systemic and institutional piece, but it'll sound strange because what I want to do in order to do that is to go back and talk about the individual. So I'm going to start with the individual, and then I'm going to move to the institutional and the systemic. And what I want to suggest is something that I've called suspicion cascades. And when I use this term, suspicion cascades, I'm referring to systematic and predictable decision-making errors that would result in racial disparities and police uses of force when these decision-making errors combine with institutional practices, general criminal justice policies, and the Fourth Amendment. So let me talk a bit about what I mean by these systemic and predictable decision-making errors. And to do so, there are three psychological processes that I could talk about: implicit racial bias, masculinity threat, and stereotype threat / racial anxiety. Because most people are not familiar with racial anxiety, that's where I'm going to focus my time before I talk about criminal justice policies, institutional practices, and the Fourth Amendment. So when I talk about racial anxiety, this is known as a situational threat. So racial anxiety is triggered in us in particular situations, and that situation is typically when we anticipate having to engage in an interracial interaction. So all of us, or most of us anyway, likely suffer from racial anxiety when we anticipate that we have to talk to someone of a different race. And then when we're actually engaged in that interaction, racial anxiety can also influence us. There's a whole body of psychological literature about this. So what do I mean by racial anxiety? That anxiety piece is simply the same as the anxiety that you might suffer in a particular situation. Racial anxiety relates to this. If I'm a person of color and I'm about to engage in an interaction with someone I don't know that well who happens to be white, my anxiety will be, maybe you're racist. Or maybe you'll say or do something during this interaction that'll make me feel very uncomfortable. And so as a result, my heart rate goes up. I'm now unable to think clearly. I actually don't even want to be in this interaction anymore. And you can imagine the physical manifestations that you view when you see me. I'm going to be very uncomfortable, and I might even like you, right? I might, if I had a chance to interact with you, but I am too uncomfortable. Now, if you're white, the way this often manifests is you are equally anxious, but you're anxious because, let's assume, you are egalitarian, consciously egalitarian, and you worry that you might actually do or say something to me that'll make me think that you're a racist. So there are all these studies about the way that this interaction can become one that's unpleasant for both, and then you end up not interacting with each other, even if you might have liked each other had you had time to do so. So how or what does this have to do with policing? There have been studies of racial anxiety with regard to the police. And with the police, racial anxiety manifests itself as the fear that they will confirm the stereotype that they are racist, right? That is the stereotype that many people hold of the police. And so even if they don't think of themselves as racist, if they're interacting with someone, they have all the symptoms that I've just talked about. So what happens both in real life and in the lab? What social psychologists have found is that you can predict whether or not police officers have used force against young black men in the field. You can actually predict whether they've used force in the previous 2 years based on their level of racial anxiety. In other words, the higher, the more worried they are that they will be perceived as racist, the more likely they are to have used force against young black men in the previous 2 years of their career. So this is both in real life and in the lab. The higher a police officer's racial anxiety, the more worried he is that he'll be viewed as racist, the more likely he will be in a shooting scenario to shoot young black men. Not white men, not Latino men, but black men. So of course we now start thinking, how could that be? How could the fear of being perceived as racist actually result in behaviors that people might say is racist, right? You are more likely in identical circumstances to shoot young black men the more worried you are that you'll be perceived as racist. So there are a number of reasons to explain this potentially counterintuitive result. So one is that as a police officer, you may suffer from racial anxiety more often when you're engaged in an interaction with a young black man, because that is when the stereotype of police racism is more salient. Secondly, we already know that during interactions that police have with individuals, they're cognitively depleted, right? They're using a lot of their mental resources, and we know that when you use more of your mental resources, you are less likely to make good decisions and more likely to rely on racial stereotypes. Third, there have been studies done that demonstrate that if you're a police officer, one of the things that makes you think a situation is more dangerous is when you're in a community that you believe does not view you as legitimate. So if you believe the community does not give you any legitimacy, you already think, you go into the situation thinking, this is going to be more dangerous. And of course, we know that when police go out into communities, they're more likely to see indigent African-American communities as being more dangerous because they think the citizenry does not view them as being legitimate. And then police officers are trained to rely on their moral authority or legitimacy to control a potentially dangerous situation. In other words, they're said, you know, when you're out in a dangerous situation, use the fact that you're a police officer to control this, right? Because people will grant you legitimacy, they'll listen to you. So you don't need to use force, you can use your words, your moral authority to de-escalate the situation, except when you're in an interaction with someone who you think does not grant you that legitimacy or that moral authority, then you are quicker to think the situation will de-escalate and that you'll have to use force to control it. So all of these are reasons why this counterintuitive, the higher you are in racial anxiety, the more likely you are to use force against young black men may result. And I haven't even talked about racial anxiety from the perspective of the citizen because I don't have time. But you can imagine if you're a young black man dealing with the police, how worried and anxious you legitimately are in this situation with exactly the type of mental and physical effects of racial anxiety we talked about earlier. And, of course, if you are to question the police, as of course we have the right to do, and in fact, as Eric Miller has written, you have to do if you want to retain some of your Fourth Amendment rights, a police officer will view this as contempt of cop, will view it as a sign of danger, and then for all the reasons I've already talked about, more likely to use force. Okay, so that is talking about the individual interaction between a police officer and a citizen. So what can we do about all of this? First, I want to suggest that the answer, as I mentioned at the beginning, is not to hire police officers who aren't high in racial anxiety, right? Like we could try to do that, but that's not the answer. That's an individual answer, and I want to speak more at the institutional and structural level. So one of the things I want to talk about then is, you know, if we could stop citizens and the police from interacting with each other, we could reduce a lot of this, couldn't we? Right? If we could stop some of these interactions, but we know that that is impossible right now when we think about current criminal justice policies, institutional practices, and the Fourth Amendment. I have a few minutes left, so let me just say a few words about each of them. When I talk about criminal justice policies, we already heard about the war on drugs. We know the types of policies that exist that encourage police officers to interact with citizens all the time. So what about police management practices then? So often when we talk about the police, we just talk about them as one monolithic group, instead of thinking about the fact that there are real tensions between management in police departments and the rank and file within police departments. Some would say that the relationship between management and the rank and file is just as bad as the relationship between the police and communities of color. Why does that matter? Management often doesn't trust the rank and file officers who are out there in the street. And so they have to find, because they're not around them, right? So they have to find proxies for determining whether the police are actually doing their jobs. And what are those proxies most often? How many summonses have you written? How many field investigation cards have you written? How many stops and frisks have you done? These are things, once again, that incentivize negative interactions between the police and communities of color. Now let me turn to the Fourth Amendment. Devon Carbado has already talked about some of the issues related to the Fourth Amendment. I want to add just a few more. So in theory, as so many of the lawyers in this room know, if the police don't have reasonable suspicion or probable cause, then you as a citizen have a right to walk away. Right? We know that. That's a fundamental principle of the Fourth Amendment, but this right is illusory, especially when it comes to people of color, so let me explain why. If a citizen walks away, the Supreme Court has said it is fine for the police officer to follow you, right? So they can follow you slowly in their vehicle as you're walking away without any suspicion, without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause at all. And what the Supreme Court has said is, that's fine, right? I'll in fact quote, a reasonable person, while this might be somewhat intimidating, a reasonable person would feel free to ignore the police behavior and go about their business. So you're going about your business, the police officer's following you, and then the Supreme Court has said you can engage in aggressive shows of force. They didn't put it that way. They said that you can engage in aggressive shows of authority without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause at all, meaning that you can yell at the person that you're following to halt. You can make yourself big and maybe even make yourself threatening without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Now imagine you're a young black man, you know what's going on in the country with regard to the police, so this scares you, and you decide you're gonna run away. And remember, this is a situation where there's no reasonable suspicion and no probable cause. So if you can walk away, why can't you run? And the Supreme Court has essentially said, if you're white in an affluent community, you get to run. That's fine, that's not suspicious. But if you run and you're in a high crime community, what the police have essentially done is create reasonable suspicion, because that's what the court says. So the court says if you run in a high crime neighborhood, that is reasonably suspicious. And what's a high crime neighborhood? I used to be a criminal defense lawyer. I'm telling you, no officer has ever had to get up on the stand to say, let me prove to you, this is a high crime neighborhood. Instead, as others have written, high crime neighborhoods are those that are indigent, majority people of color. So what has the Supreme Court done? Basically, they've given the police a reasonable suspicion formula, right? You can go out there without any suspicion at all. You can follow someone for as long as you want. Then you can engage in an aggressive show of authority, essentially goading a citizen into running. And then if they run, and if you happen to be in a high crime neighborhood, in other words, a person of color, then they can chase you and tackle you to the ground and use force. And there are studies that demonstrate that after a foot chase, police are more likely to use force against young black men. So I am out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Richardson, we have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions, and we have a microphone set up in the middle for anyone who would like to pose a question to our panel. Any questions out there immediately? Yes.
Dean Richardson, I was curious, sort of with James Forman's book that came out this year and the conversation about policing communities even when the cops are a majority people of color and how that interacts with your racial anxiety.
Sure, and I will bring Professor Carbado into this discussion too, because we are both working on a piece related to that book. But what I'll say is, and this relates to Nancy's work too, police departments have cultures, right? And so to fit into a particular culture, it often doesn't matter whether you're a woman, a man, a person of color, until you get to a certain tipping point, right? So if I'm the only person of color in a majority white police department, it's very likely that in that particular situation, I'm going to learn the culture of that organization and act similarly to others within that organization. So in some of the stereotype, threat, and racial anxiety studies, there's often just a small number of black officers, but the black officers who are in those studies have the same racial anxiety. They are just as worried about being viewed as racist, and in some of these studies also have that same use of force in the field and in the studies. So I think the number of people within an organization matter. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think DC is a majority people of color that are field officers. I think that's true, or a lot.
And so is Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, so just sort of, if you think that is the tipping point, do you think that obviously this is sort of wide open, but
Yep.
is there, what does that look like as far as policing communities in those spaces? I guess, do you think there's any difference once you've reached sort of a critical number or thing along
and I would love for others to jump in too, but my own personal thought is it's both the number, but then it's the things that we've talked about. How do you change the incentives that police have when they go out there to do their job? How are they judged? How are they trained, right? Are they trained to de-escalate situations, or are they trained to act in this quote-unquote macho way, right, when they're dealing with potentially dangerous suspects? So I think it has to be both. It has to be a change in the culture, in the training, in the incentives, in the laws, as we've heard the other panelists speak about. So thank you for that question. Yeah, I think it has to involve all of that.
Yeah, yes. Professor Mears, yeah.
This is a quick comment for Nancy. I'm not sure what you're doing with this piece, but during my service on the President's Task Force of 21st Century Policing, we had a whole session on gender and composition of police forces, and so you might want to look at the testimony, because one of the things that was really interesting about that was relating the shift work of policing to the shift work of nursing, which we all know is overwhelmingly female, and why is it that we wouldn't see similar distributions of gender distributions in policing? And the kind of off-the-record answer that we got from the women who were testifying was that there's some interesting dynamics going on with unions who refuse to allow management to bargain for part-time work, where you would think shift work would be very conducive to part-time workers, which is what you see in nursing. Like emergency room nurses often just work the weekends and don't work during the week, and that work is just as stressful as policing. But anyway, there might be something there for you.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Yeah, and I think shift work would be a good idea, right? Like not just a neutral, but actually a good idea.
Yes.
Question perhaps for Professor Carbado. We have on the screen a list of kind of low-level public disorder type offenses that raise the level of police contact with the public. My question is, what would be your recommendation, for others as well, for legislators to change those offenses? Is it a matter of decriminalization? What are the options out there? Because that, to the extent that conduct is certainly a concern to the public, there's maybe training issues, how police forces interact, but from a legislative perspective, what can we do up front to better structure those interactions to ensure that the egregious cases of disorderly conduct, of public intoxication, of these sorts of offenses, that those are in fact allow a police officer to arrest a person or take them into custody, and in other low-level situations they're not held. What recommendations would you have? Because it seems like a very difficult problem at that very lowest level of public disorder offense. What should be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many respects, your question invites at least a partial answer in the sense that it included some distinction between low and low, which is to say, I think right now the move has been in the direction of criminalizing far too much. And I think there is a literature on criminalization that suggests that perhaps we've gone too far. The other thing I would say in relationship to that, it's not simply that you have the mass criminalization standing alone, it's the way it's interacting with particular legal regimes. So for example, if I think about the mass criminalization problem, again, specifically with respect to Fourth Amendment law, I would say that part of what you could do on the Fourth Amendment side, or that state legislators could do, because the Fourth Amendment, it just provides the floor, is establish a regime that requires police officers to inform people of their rights. So you are approaching me and you're asking me for an ID, you don't have to give it to me, go about your business. I mean, this is just fiction that these encounters are consensual, and I think it's that problem in conjunction with the mass criminalization that makes contact particularly troubling.
So I suspect that there are a lot of potential note topics that have been hatched here in this discussion. The last hand raised was that of the editor-in-chief, and I know it's not a question but a command, and that is that we wrap up the panel. But before doing so, I want to thank the three distinguished panelists for their wonderful presentations and provoking thought and further engagement that we will have for the rest of the day. So thank you very much for your presence and for contributing to this symposium.
Cheers.